Great. Well, I think it makes sense to get started, and seems like some folks are still coming on. My name is Sophie Janeway. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Outreach Coordinator for the Natural Resources Council of Maine. And I'm so glad that you could all join us to celebrate Earth Day today. Just a few housekeeping items. All of you who are on the call, your video and your audio are muted. But throughout Sue's presentation, you can type questions into the Q&A, which if you're on the computer, just scroll down to the bottom of your screen and there's a little Q&A and chat bubble. And so I'll be answering questions throughout, and then after Sue's presentation, we will also have some Q&A time and some action items for folks to take for how to support addressing climate change in Maine. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in throughout the presentation. But without further ado, I will pass it over to Sue Ely.
Thanks, Sophie. And you can still see my screen, Sophie?
Yes, I can see your screen and I can see you.
Perfect. So welcome everybody. Thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. My name is Sue Ely. I am the Clean Energy Policy Advisor and Staff Attorney here for the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Sophie gave you a little overview, but just to lay things out about what I'm going to present today. My goal is to give an overview of climate pollution from transportation in the state and how we can reduce that pollution in order to meet our climate change goals that were set last legislative session. I'm going to start out with a couple of fun polling questions and try to keep it interesting as we go. And then hopefully, if I can keep all this on time, we will have enough time for questions. And as Sophie said, we have disabled audio and video for participants, but we have a Q&A box. And so please, I know I'm a fast talker and I have so much information that I'm hoping that I can get through today. And so if I said something too fast, or if you wanted to have a follow-up question, please put your question in the Q&A. If it's something that Sophie can answer, she can respond to you in real time. And if not, we can try our best to get that answer to you in the question and answer section. So please use it freely and don't be afraid to ask a question. I'm going to try my best to talk slowly, but if for some reason you didn't catch it, just ask us. Let me get my slides forwarding here. So just really quickly too, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, we are the largest environmental nonprofit here in the state. We have over 25,000 members and supporters. And the Climate and Clean Energy team that Sophie and I are on, we work on everything from electric vehicles and public transportation to renewable energy and energy efficiency to reduce climate pollution. But we have lots of other wonderful teams at NRCM who do sustainability projects and protecting Maine's North Woods and waters, and also engaging on federal issues that affect Maine. So please check us out if you haven't already. But with that, I'm going to start my presentation on transportation and climate change in Maine. And I'm going to start with just what is hopefully a fun poll. I'm going to launch the poll and then I'm going to explain what the questions are. The first question is just to get an understanding of how you all on the phone today use public transportation here in Maine. I'm asking what type of public transportation have you used? City bus, long distance shuttles like the Concord coach that you might take to get to the airport, shuttles, carpools and van pools, trains, or some other type of public transportation. So go ahead and click those buttons. The second question is, how often do you use public transportation? So is it I've never ever set foot on a bus in Maine. I use it every once in a while, once a month, once a week, or just about every day. And again, if you, and then the last one is, have you or do you use walking or biking to get to work or run errands? I live in Yarmouth and commute to Augusta, so I cannot claim that I've ever ridden my bicycle, but I do walk to the grocery store. So you know, whatever fits your situation. There's no right answer. I'm just curious about people's experience with public transportation here in the state. I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to answer. Looks like the poll got closed. Oh, hey, Sophie.
I just shared the results.
Okay.
Out with folks.
All right. So it looks like 78 of us on the line tonight this morning have used the long distance shuttles like the Concord Coach, which is pretty interesting. Also, a lot of folks have taken advantage of carpools and van pools and the train. If you are one of people who answered other, I'd love to hear what your other was in the Q&A section. There's some folks who've taken shuttles, and then 19% of us have taken the city bus. So that's pretty interesting. Most of us, close to 90%, have used public transportation, but not regularly, which sort of fits with the way people in Maine use public transportation. So that is in line with what we've seen in other polling. And then 60% say that they have used walking or biking to get to work or run errands. So very interesting. Thank you. I have another poll that I want to do really quickly here. And that is just to find out where everyone's level of knowledge is about what is happening in transportation and climate change here in the state. So the next poll is how familiar, well, have you heard of or read about any of the three following? And this is a multiple choice, so you can click all that you've seen. The Maine Climate Council, the Transportation Working Group, which is a subgroup of the Maine Climate Council, and then the Transportation and Climate Initiative. I'll give you another couple seconds to fill that out. Looks like most people have answered. All right, I'm going to close the poll here and share the results. And you guys are pretty hip to all of these things already, so I won't spend too much time on the nitty-gritty of the Climate Council, because it looks like just about everybody has heard of or read about the Climate Council. And then, of course, the Transportation Working Group is a subgroup of the Climate Council that we're going to talk a bit about. And then I'm going to spend a lot of time on the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which 70% of you have already had some experience with. So I'm going to jump in now to my first slide. So as many of you know, we have really great greenhouse gas reduction goals here in the state of Maine. And they're not just goals, they are actual requirements that we need to meet in order to reach these. They're set in statute. So the biggest thing is that Maine must reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 45% below 1990 levels by the year 2030, and then at least 80% by the year 2050. And so this chart, the green line shows where Maine's emissions have been. The little blue dots show the greenhouse gas reduction requirements, and then that gray line sort of shows the trend that we need to achieve. You can see that we are on our way, and that's wonderful. But there's a lot of work still to be done in order to reach our goal by 2030 of the 45% reduction, and then our 2050 goal of an 80% reduction. So the good news is that we're on our way. The hard news is that we have a lot of work to do to get there, and it's not going to just happen. And of course, the group tasked with helping chart a course to achieve these reductions is the Maine Climate Council. It is, of course, not just the Climate Council. There's a lot of different groups doing a lot of really important work to reduce Maine's greenhouse gas emissions. You've got individual citizens taking strong actions. Youth groups are out doing climate strikes and making really important moves. We've got lots of nonprofits working on these goals. But the big game in town right now in Maine is the Maine Climate Council. And the Maine Climate Council and their subgroups, which includes the Transportation Working Group, have been working very hard and having monthly meetings to try to figure out what is the best way to reach these greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And we gave a little bit of a spoiler in our invite to this, but I just want to know, I'm going to launch this poll. How many people here know what percentage of Maine's pollution comes from the transportation sector? And those would be our cars, trucks, buses, airplanes, ferries. Do you think it's 23%, 37%, 54%, or 62%? Just another couple of seconds here. All right, and you guys are pretty good. It's 54%. So it is the lion's share of our emissions comes from the Maine's transportation sector. And you can see here, it's 54%. And it's 54%, it's over half, and it is the only sector that is not going down. It's if anything, it's creeping up just a little bit. So we have a lot of work to do in this sector. A lot of that is because you've seen some pretty good decreases in our the energy world, and not as much advancement in transportation sector. The other thing is just that Mainers drive a lot. We on average drive 13,500 miles. When you add that up to all of the citizens in Maine, that's a lot of miles. And rural drivers are taking 45% more trips and driving twice as far as the urban drivers. And again, this makes perfect sense. Maine is the most rural state in the country. And so it's a longer drive to get to work, to school, to daycare, doctor's appointments, to the grocery store. It all is just a little bit farther. And there are fewer public transportation or non-car alternatives for folks who live in these rural communities and suburban communities, because the trend holds true for suburban folks as well. So we drive a lot in this state. So there are two main strategies that the Maine Climate Council is looking at to reduce transportation pollution, and these two main strategies make a lot of sense, and they are also where NRCM has been putting a lot of our efforts. So the first one is just finding a way to help Maine drivers drive less. That is making walking and biking more accessible. It's very difficult to make a shift to walking and biking if you don't feel safe. And so we need to make our infrastructure feel safe and fun and easy. Otherwise, people aren't going to want to walk and bike, even if they really enjoy those activities. The other one is to make more access to public transportation. So in some places in Maine, it is building it from the ground up. There's communities that could have really great public transportation systems but don't. And there are other ones that have existing transportation that can be expanded to have longer hours, more frequent stops, and just expanding in general. And then the other one is to make our cars less polluting. And right now the name of the game is electric vehicles, and getting more of those on the road and getting more electric vehicle infrastructure out there. We can get there. The initial polling from the Transportation Working Group and the Clean Climate Council shows that it's possible that we can get that 80% reduction from our transportation sector by the year 2050, but we have so much work to do in order to get there. And it's going to take some legislation, it's going to take some actions by citizens and everybody in between. So I think all of us can agree with this general sentiment that the public transportation in Maine could be a lot better. I wanted to show the difference between Maine, where we spend only 86 cents per person on public transportation, versus Vermont, where they spend over $12 per person. And I couldn't even find a map that showed all of Maine's public transportation systems. The fact of the matter is that, you know, Vermont has a really great system. It's a good example of a rural state with a really useful and productive public transportation system that people are excited to use. And those key things are, they have a lot of interconnection between different communities in the state, and then outside of the state. So you can see that there's lots of different ways for folks to get from very rural communities in Vermont to Boston or Springfield or New York. And then they can get within the state. So they have enough buses with enough frequency to get people around. And this, you know, we do have some lovely public transportation systems, mostly just regional, but they aren't well connected, and they definitely don't connect very well to other places. And a lot of that is just how much money you spend. You know, that's a big difference between 86 cents per person and $12 per person. It's not just reducing climate emissions that is improved by making more access to public transportation. It's a huge one, and it's really, really important. But it also, you know, it reduces other local pollution. It provides for better health. More people are out walking and biking, so your general health is better. There's lower instances of asthma. Car accidents go down. And then also there's a really important element of choice here. So there are lots of people who either cannot or do not want to rely on a car. And that is a choice that a lot of people don't have. They need to borrow a ride or borrow a car or figure out a different way to get from point A to point B, and there's no public transportation. And so really giving people the choice of living a car-free or a car-light existence is a really nice and important thing that can be accomplished through better public transportation. And of course, electric vehicles. And this is when we do have to drive our cars, or when we want to drive our cars or trucks, that we can drive them in a low emissions sort of way. Maine is a great place to own an electric vehicle. Our electric grid is relatively clean. Of course, we can always improve it, and we can always get greater penetration of renewable resources. But if you look nationwide, we have a relatively clean grid. And so it's a great place to plug in an electric vehicle and drive it around. The technology is getting better every day. We still have federal rebates for a lot of these different vehicles. And then of course the state of Maine has its rebate program through the Efficiency Maine Trust. And the Efficiency Maine Trust is also helping to build out charging infrastructure for cars. And so of course that can be two different types. You can have the DC fast chargers, which is when you are zipping up the turnpike and you really need to get from point A to point B, and it's 500 miles and you need to stop and get a charge and get a big charge on your big battery, and you need to do it quickly, that is the stop for you. And there's one in the Kennebunk Plaza, and there's one in the Gardner Plaza. And then there is the slower charge, the level 2 charge, which is great for if you're stopping at LL Bean to do some Christmas shopping and you want to give yourself a 20 miles of range. You can park in their lot and charge up your car. They have the universal chargers and the Tesla chargers. So it takes all types of charging to make an electric vehicle future possible. You also need charging at workplaces and apartment complexes, as well as people's private homes. And so that is some work that is ongoing, and we of course need to do so much more to really make sure that we can have a robust adoption of electric vehicles. Of course, all of this that I've been talking about, expanding public transportation, expanding EV infrastructure, continuing these EV rebates, all of these things are necessary in order to reach our climate goals. They also will require significant amounts of funding. And we know that funding is always at a premium. And so one really exciting opportunity for funding for these types of initiatives is something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And of course, a lot of you had said that you'd heard about this, so apologies if I'm going over things that you already know, but the Transportation and Climate Initiative is an incredibly important and critical tool to move forward. And it is something that we're hoping that you can take from this conversation and tell your friends about and support publicly, because I think it is a really amazing opportunity that Maine has the opportunity to sign on to. So the Transportation and Climate Initiative is also called TCI for short. It's a terrible acronym, but it is catchy. So TCI, it's 12 different states along New England and the Mid-Atlantic, as well as DC, have been working together to develop this program. It's a cap and invest program. It has a lot of similarities to RGGI, which Maine is also a member of. And essentially what it is we would, if Maine signs on to it, we would cap the amount of pollution that could come from the transportation sector. And that cap would start somewhere high, easier to accomplish. And then over time, it ratchets down. And so every year you're getting a little bit less pollution and a little bit less pollution until you reach your goal. The polluters pay for the right to pollute or emit carbon into the atmosphere. So in this case, the regulated entity would be gasoline and diesel suppliers in New England, and they would pay for the amount of what the carbon equivalent of their sales would be. And so over time, this again would ratchet down, and the fee that they're paying in order to emit would go right back into communities who are participating in TCI. It is a program, the Cap and Invest program has been really successful in New England through RGGI in reducing pollution from our energy sector. And one of the benefits that these states have is that they all have a lot of experience with the RGGI program. And so they've seen what's worked really well, and they have seen what has not worked as well. And so this is an opportunity to not just replicate the RGGI experience, but to make it better for the states that are involved. Right now, the states just finished putting out a draft MOU and are in the process of revising that memorandum of understanding to reflect comments that they received. And then we're expecting to see some type of final memorandum of understanding this summer that the governor would have the opportunity to sign on to. Benefits from TCI would include that the states could put that money towards better public transportation, more modern and resilient infrastructure. So trains in some places, if you're going to have a long distance shuttle, like I dream of a long distance shuttle from Yarmouth to Augusta, you know, making sure that there's Wi-Fi on that so that people can use that time productively, making things safer. Economic jobs, jobs and economic growth. There is a huge potential to grow the number of clean transportation jobs in the state. And then of course, healthier communities. Based on Maine's share, so it would be based on, again, how much basically if gasoline and diesel you're selling in your state. And so based on Maine's share, we could stand to get about $130 to $160 million a year. That's a lot. It's a lot more than we're currently spending on our public transportation system. Just to give you some perspective, the Greater Portland Metro, which is the biggest transit group in the state, it serves the Greater Portland area. Their entire annual operating budget is only $11 million. And so, you know, this $130 to $160 million is not going to cure all of Maine's transportation woes, but it is going to make a pretty big dent in what we're doing and what our goals are. So it's a huge opportunity for the state. And again, we're looking at seeing a final memorandum of agreement that the states could sign on to this summer. One question that we get a lot about TCI is how do we make sure that it's a good program and that it is administered fairly and equitably? You know, the costs of signing on, there is a cost, and we want to make sure that those funds are going towards the communities that we want to boost. So one is to just make sure that Maine commits to a strong public process for designing, implementing, and then reviewing the TCI. And again, Maine would have a fair amount of autonomy to figure out which of its communities it wants to invest most heavily in and how it wants to prioritize those projects. And so it'd be really important to make sure that there's a transparent process in the state of Maine for investing those funds. Again, making sure we're investing in the right communities. Are they communities of color? Are they low-income communities, new Mainers? Folks who have disproportionately lacked access to public transportation, like rural communities, and then what types of programs are best to put in those. The other one is there's lots of ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's lots of ways that we can invest to get greenhouse gas emissions and see other benefits. So improved air quality, safety, job trainings, protecting workers. So making sure that when we're investing those funds that we are getting all of the co-benefits that are possible instead of just being really narrowly focused on one benefit. And then of course, just making sure that there's a robust feedback process. So are we measuring, are we verifying so that we know we're spending that money in the best possible way? So there are two main ways that you guys can engage really effectively in transportation issues right now. The first is we have a petition about the Climate Council to support the actions of the Climate Council and encourage them to be bold. And so there's a link to sign our petition. I apologize, this is because it's a webinar, I don't think you can cut and paste that into your browser, but Sophie is going to put that into maybe the Q&A box or the chat box. So you can cut and paste that link. So that's a petition, an NRCM petition that you can sign. There is also a portal for the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It goes straight to the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It isn't an NRCM portal. You can click on that link, which again, Sophie's going to put in one of the chat boxes. She might be telling me which one. Yeah, so Sophie put it in the chat box to everybody. So for the petition as well as a comment in support of TCI. It takes a little bit of time to comment into the TCI portal because it takes you to a new page and you have to fill out some information. But So I would encourage you to cut and paste that link and do it after the presentation. But this is incredibly important. The states are all paying attention to these portal comments, and the governor is paying attention, and the governor's staffers are paying attention. And so we really want to be supportive of the TCI program. And that advocacy is important now, and it will become even more important once once the final MOU is available and it's real, and the governor can actually sign on to it. So it will be an issue that you'll hear a lot more about going forward. But right now is a great time to be supportive into the portal. So those are two concrete steps you can take coming out of this presentation. So that's my presentation. I think we've left enough time for questions. And I'm gonna hope that Sophie comes back on and we can sort of tackle them together.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of really great questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to start with those, and then just please keep sending your questions into the Q&A, or and if we get through those, then folks can raise their hands and we can tackle questions that way. So the first question, Sue, is, will TCI benefits necessarily feed transportation investments, or could they end up going to the general fund?
Yeah, so the details will be in the MOU when it's finally released. Excuse me. But the way that it's written now, it would require that the funds actually tackle transportation issues. So whether that's electric vehicle charging infrastructure or like zoning issues, you know, there'd be probably a broad swath of things that it could get to, but it should have a nexus with reducing emissions. And that is really similar to the way we in Maine have invested our RGGI funds. Other states, I think, have not had as much success, but we've had a lot of success with those funds going to the Efficiency Maine Trust, and that's where all those lovely rebates have gone towards efficiency and weatherization, because we have been so good about investing those funds into reducing people's reliance on electricity. And so here, the goal would be to reduce people's reliance on gasoline and diesel by investing in public transportation and electric vehicle infrastructure.
There is a person who is a youth leader at their church, and they're interested in learning more about what young people in Maine are doing to advocate for clean transportation.
Yeah, so there is a youth representative on the Maine Climate Council. There are youth representatives on the Maine Climate Council, and then all of the working groups. And so the Transportation Working Group has Beckett Slayton, who is a student, Mainer. He's a student at Bowdoin, and he has been engaged on the council. And then, of course, he's been working with, a lot of the youth groups. There are a number of them who've been doing climate strikes and working through their colleges and working through their high schools to advocate for clean energy solutions. I can put, I don't know who's asking the question, but we can try to put them in touch with the youth that we've been working with to see if there's a way for them to connect on a personal level. But the youth have been really engaged. When they came to the Climate Council meeting this winter, it was really moving. And actually there's a picture in a slide, just the last one. This is a picture of the various youth groups that came to the Climate Council meeting this winter, and they were a powerful force. And you could see the administration perk up and listen, because they are this next generation that is going to be making decisions here in the state. So it was very powerful.
And I'll just also say that if our folks are interested in getting involved with some of the youth organizing that's happening around transportation and other climate issues, you can email either Sue or myself, and we'd be happy to connect you. And our email addresses are up on the screen. So does public transportation include private services like SEER buses? Do private services get funding?
That is a very complicated question. And I've been a little bit loosey-goosey in my language around this. So it really depends. There are some private public partnerships, and then there are some straight up private enterprises. So it's sort of a case by case situation. But I don't think in this scenario under TCI, these types of like a purely private system would get funds, but it would really depend on how that system was set up. So, you know, if it's there's a lot of situations where you can qualify for public funds if you can show matching funds from a private source. So, you know, that's a public-private partnership as opposed to a purely private entity, and they would have different requirements. So that is like the worst loosey-goosey answer that I could give, but it's sort of a case-by-case situation where you're looking at what the model is that the entity is using. But it wouldn't be a purely private enterprise.
So are there community-based groups who are on the Maine Climate Council that are actively engaging suburban and rural communities to build buy-in on reducing private vehicle usage or working on shifting culture mindset around using private vehicles?
Are there community-based groups who are on the Maine Climate Council? Again, I guess it depends on how you define community-based groups. There's lots of really good partnerships out there. The Maine Climate Council is the main group, and then the Transportation Working Group is the subgroup, and they have more of the transit-specific advocates who are on it. And there is a demand in suburban and rural communities to reduce private vehicle usage. There's a lot of folks that's just never going to work for, and they're not interested. That's not the groups we're looking at. You know, this is a lot of folks trying to help older residents or residents who don't have the ability to drive a car for whatever reason, having them be able to get to their doctor's appointments and their employment and education, and just the grocery store without easily, without it being a really big deal. And so when you build that infrastructure for those groups, it opens up the opportunity for all sorts of different people to decide to reduce their private vehicle usage. So there are some, there could be more, but actually the Transportation Working Group process has been, I've been pleasantly, I don't want to say surprised because it makes it sound like I didn't think they'd do a good job, but I have been really impressed with the openness of the process and their interest in getting stories from a whole bunch of different places. And so I would say yes. There could always be more, but I would say yes, there's been a lot of that work done.
Great. Can you speak to the job impacts that TCI and expanding public transportation infrastructure and expanding EV infrastructure would have, and if you know whether or not those would offset any jobs that were lost through fossil fuel suppliers?
Sure. So there was modeling done, and the caveat is the world is so different than it was even 3 weeks ago. But the TCI group did do some economic modeling on what the economic impact of the TCI process would be, and I actually have this slide that I can pull up. And they looked at 3 different cap levels, a 20% cap, a 22% cap, and a 25% cap. And you can, and I apologize for the tiny font and all of that, but if you look down, there is an increase in jobs from what's the reference case, and the reference case is business as usual, assuming everything goes normal. And as the cap increases, you actually do see an increase in jobs. So at a 25% cap, you're looking at 8,900 new jobs. Those are going to be transit operators, transit groups, mechanics working on electric vehicles, infrastructure jobs, and that's a net calculation. So for jobs lost, Maine, we don't have an extractive industry here, so you're not seeing job losses in those categories as much as you're seeing job gains from growing a whole new sector, which would be this public transit sector.
Awesome. So we've got about 8 more questions, and we will try and, I think we'll be able to get through all of those, but if you have more, also keep putting them in. So I'm hoping we can shift a little bit to some of the questions about cycling and biking and infrastructure.
Yeah.
One question, are there plans to train cyclists to ride more safely and predictably in traffic, and to build confidence among riders to share the road?
Yeah, and at this point, a lot of those plans are pretty loose. There isn't a formal plan going to I should step back and say the process here is that the working groups are all wrestling with these sort of big, gnarly questions about where can we get the biggest bang for our buck to reduce transit emissions. And the transportation working group is looking at transportation. There's an energy group looking from our energy sector. There's coastal and marine group looking at emissions from marine sources, as well as harm to our marine environment. So everybody's wrestling with this. And then the goal is for them to bring forth sort of the best ideas that they can come up with and give them to the full climate council. And the full climate council will then wrestle with those ideas and sort of massage them into a full plan that can go to the governor and start to be implemented, can put forward suggestions for legislation for next year. And so we're still in this planning phase. And so I don't want to make it sound like they have a full-fledged plan, but there are some very there's at least one very good advocate for walking and biking who is on the transportation working group, who has put forward a lot of really great ideas about how to do just that, which is improve cycling knowledge and also driver knowledge, and to figure out how to build our infrastructure so that there's fewer conflicts. And then also one pretty easy thing that's been brought up over and over again is just getting to kids when they're little and teaching them safe biking skills and teaching it in schools, making it part of schooling as well as driver's education. So it's not final yet, but it's definitely been brought up and discussed at great length.
Great. What is already being done to increase the amount of EV chargers that are distributed across the state? What can be done in the future?
Yeah, so a lot of the funds, so the Efficiency Maine Trust is installing electric vehicle chargers, both the fast ones and the level 2 ones. And a lot of that has come from all of it has come from the VW charging settlement funds. There's a VW, their emissions scandal. Maine got a fairly large settlement, and some of that money has been put towards installing chargers across the state. That money is pretty much allocated now. And then there was just a docket at the Public Utilities Commission that came out from legislation from last session that directed the Public Utilities Commission to do pilot programs around electric vehicle charging infrastructure and beneficial electrification. And so the Efficiency Maine Trust and Central Maine Power submitted proposals, and some money was allocated. Unfortunately, it was only money for level 2 chargers. We lobbied with a bunch of other groups that it should be level 2 and level 3, the fast chargers, but unfortunately the Public Utilities Commission didn't think that that was warranted at this point in time. But there's a large number of level 2 chargers that are likely to be distributed in the next 2 years through Central Maine Power and Efficiency Maine Trust. But we need more. We need all types. We need to do a better job of getting them in rental units, so multifamily homes where individuals have less of an ability to install their own chargers. We need to have more distribution in rural communities. And of course, we need more fast chargers in strategic places around the state to make sure that people can get where they need to get in a timely manner.
Great. So there are a few questions about the power that fuels these electric vehicles. Do you know how much solar or how much energy it would take to power an EV for a Mainer who on average is driving 13,500 miles a year?
Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sure that we could get it. And Sophie, do you know?
Nope.
No, I don't either. The best I can do is pull up this. It's from the Union of Concerned Scientists. And it looks at sort of the different energy markets and how plugging in an electric vehicle, your average electric vehicle into the grid impact what the range of miles per gallon based on the fuel mix. So like you see that dark blue, it's the Rocky Mountain region. They have a lot of coal fueling their grid. And so even if you put in an electric vehicle, you're plugging it in and then charging it from a grid that has a lot of coal. So you're not going to get the equivalent is not very good. You're getting an equivalent of 38 miles per gallon because of the emissions from the coal plant. In New England, that is 103 miles per gallon equivalent. The average is 73. So we're above average, far above average in the cleanliness of our grid. But I couldn't tell you what percentage is solar or how much solar you would need to fuel your vehicle. And it would depend on the battery. But it's a good question. And it's one that I want to go look up now. So I have it in my pocket. But Maine's grid is not perfect, but is much cleaner than a lot of other out there. So this is a good place to drive an electric vehicle.
We have a participant, Scott from Norway, who's telling us that EVs get about 4 miles per kilowatt of electricity. In case that is helpful to folks. Does TCI include shipping ports?
Yeah. And it can. It does not necessarily, but it's definitely a source of emissions, and so it could include shipping ports. And of course, the Maine Climate Council Transportation Working Group is looking at Maine's ports and emissions from Maine's ports and how to reduce those emissions.
Awesome. Since TCI is a regional effort, and we'll have a lot more say in what we choose to spend the money on than we would with some federal funding, can we choose to include enough protections for farmers, fishermen, and other traditional non-highway fuel users?
Interesting. Yeah. So who asked that question? Are they still on? Can they elaborate on it?
Let me see if this person is still on. It looks like he is. So, Richard, I'm going to allow you to talk in case you want to clarify this question.
Well,
Richard, are you there?
I'm concerned that the costs would go up to supply fuels for farming and fishing and wood cutting and things like that are traditional main uses of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a balance of how much their costs might go up as opposed to what benefits they might get from trying to transition into also into electric propulsion somehow or things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I brought back up the modeling results. And in the modeling results, I think it's important to note, and I didn't mention it, is the modeling results assumed that the distributors of diesel and gasoline who are levied that fee to sell their diesel and gasoline into the TCI regions puts that cost right back on consumers. So even if you assume that they increase the price of gasoline or the price of diesel by whatever the cost is, which it would be between 5 and 17 cents per gallon, you still see these benefits. So you still see on net it's still causing an increase in GDP, an increase in disposable personal income, an increase in jobs. So on the whole, you still see the benefit, even if all of those costs are turned on to the consumer. But there are those specific communities that you identified where it's going to be really tough with the existing technology to switch over to electric, or maybe the technology is not quite there, or it's cost prohibitive. The states can make their program fit their needs. And so there are ways for the states to sort of insulate those vulnerable communities, whether they be a farming community or a fishing community. And that level of detail is still being negotiated. And so it's still open for comment and feedback. So yes, but the devil is in the details. And this is where we need our advocates to identify those types of vulnerable communities. But certainly those communities are on the radar screen, and there are ways to, some people have talked about making part of the money go to a rebate for the lowest income people who have less ability to, move their job or work from home or buy an electric vehicle, or certain other ways to insulate different communities. So it's a very important thing to consider, and there is enough flexibility in the system, in the program, to accommodate those types of concerns.
Great. We've got a few more questions and about 5 more minutes, so we'll try and move through them. But if we do not get to any of the questions that you want answered, then please feel free to send us an email, and we would be happy to answer it. There have been a couple questions about electricity and that's used by EVs when they are being built and over the life cycle, and how that compares, and also about how it compares to whether biomass fits into that being renewable, and about Maine Yankee and nuclear renewable energy being a part of that mix or not.
Yeah, so Maine is part of the New England ISO system, and depending on whether you're looking just at Maine or the New England grid as a whole, we would include all of the electricity that's coming. So it's whatever's on the grid at the time is what the electricity blend is for calculating out what the emissions would be. Biomass is, certain biomass is considered renewable under Maine's renewable standards. And then on the life cycle impact, there have been tons of calculations about the life cycle impact of electric vehicles, and certainly the construction of the battery does have a larger upfront resource cost, but that is easily made up within the first year or two of driving an electric vehicle. So it very quickly pencils out to be less energy to drive your electric vehicle, even including the life cycle costs of the battery.
What percentage of Maine transportation fuel is now public transportation? If this was all funded to go electric, would that help?
Can you read that one again, Sophie?
What percentage of Maine transportation fuel use is public transportation? And if this went all electric, how much would that help?
It's a pretty small amount, just because we have such a small amount of public transportation relative to private drivers. Most of our emissions are single passenger vehicles, light duty. And then the big part is sort of medium to heavy duty vehicles. So switching all of our buses at this point in time to electric isn't going to help as much as getting people out of their single passenger cars and into a bus or into a carpool. That's going to be the biggest bang for our buck. And then of course, getting people out of their vehicles altogether and into an electric vehicle. So that's the vehicle. Buses are incredibly high users of diesel. They don't get a lot of miles to the gallon. We're moving big equipment. And so of course they have a pretty big emissions profile, but there's just not as many buses out there, if that makes sense.
Great. And one last question, and then we will wrap up. Acadia National Park has a federal transportation plan in the works, along with other organizations like Western Maine Transportation System and a lot of the CAP agencies around the state, which are starting to put together and have been for a while, putting together public transportation plans. Could TCI benefit or impact programs like that and expand what we already have in the state?
Yeah. So one of the things that Maine has struggled with is, because there's so little money to put towards public transportation, is we've lacked a lot of state matching funds to put towards federal grants. And so being able to have funds to say, we can fund 50% of this program, we can get 50% of the program from federal dollars. And so having more money to fund transportation projects for the state allows us to leverage more federal funds. So an example is with the Greater Portland Metro and the shuttle bus Zoom, which serves Saco, Old Orchard, and Biddeford. They were able to use the dollars that came to the state through the VW settlement to match federal dollars to buy a couple of electric buses. Without those matching funds that came from the state, but they came from the state through the VW settlement, they wouldn't have been competitive for that grant. And so they couldn't have gotten that grant money. So it doubled the money that we were able to spend on upgrades. And so, yeah, having more money in the state through TCI would allow Maine to be more competitive for federal grants, which means we're really leveraging those dollars really well. So yes.
Yeah, definitely. And the only thing I would add to that, Sue, is that folks who work on public transportation might already be aware that there are a lot of federal rules about how you're spending those transportation dollars. And one of the things that's really exciting about TCI is that because it's regional and because there's so much focus on the state opting into a plan that works for Maine, communities in the state have a lot more say over the sorts of things that we spend money on, which is why it's so important that folks get in touch with Governor Mills and submit comments to the TCI portal. So I will put those in the chat again, or they're right there. I'll put them in again just in case folks haven't seen them. And I hope that you will all submit comments, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you.